Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress that had given us the Declaration. Ben Franklin and Roger Sherman and a few others. 28 former congressmen, 2 college presidents, 3 college professors, 9 from foreign countries, several doctors and scientists. And they agreed on several basic principles, and yet they had all kinds of dissension. They agreed that the laws of nature and of nature's God, they really were imbued, inspired by what John called the real preamble, the Declaration of Independence. Now, they had been through this war, and there sat George Washington as the president of this convention. The delegates agreed on the basic values and principles, the laws of nature and nature's God, God-given and inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property, and were moving towards a constitution to protect these things. Governments established by covenant or mutual promise, giving government only such limited power as the people delegate to it. All people, rulers included, have a sinful nature. They believed in Jeremiah 17:9. They'd all read it and knew it. The heart is desperately wicked. They knew Romans 3:23. They knew both the Old and the New Testament, that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. They knew these things. They had seen it. They had seen the arrogant face of evil of King George and his minions. And they reacted and repulsed by it. So they had some procedures established. And they elected the President Washington. 1 vote per state as cast as majority of the state's delegation desired. This was really important when they came to the ratification process. And again, they needed 9 instead of all 13. So they'd already made quite a step. To prevent false rumors, proceedings kept secret until the last delegate died. Isn't that something? Madison in 1836. No delegate could speak more than twice on an issue until all others had spoken, then only by permission of the convention. All remarks were addressed to the president. So when you hear speeches and so forth, and Madison and Gouverneur Morris and some of these guys made a great number of speeches, just terrific stuff. And little James Madison kept unbelievable notes of the whole convention. They're old, and the great speech of Benjamin Franklin calling him to prayer was addressed to Mr. President, George Washington. Most issues resolved by reaching consensus. But, again, you had 31 lawyers in a room, and you had a whole bunch of, I'd say these guys were primarily intellectuals, highly educated. They'd studied Plato, it was Republic in Greek, and Latin. They knew the scriptures, the nuances. And of course they were wrestling with the Enlightenment going on over there in France, and they had the cross currents of all kinds of influence that they were sorting out. But they were sent as the representatives of virtual 13 countries, really. These states wanted autonomy. They were jealous of each other. And their representatives wanted to fight for their colloquial, their unique interests. Now they had little states and huge states, the Vermont and Maryland. And then you had big states like New York and really Virginia. Physically big states with great capacity to grow. You had populous states, a lot of population. And smallly populated states. And all of these people they didn't want to be walked on. Don't tread on me was one of their slogans. They had fought and bled, and some of their favorite people had died in this process, and they weren't about to give up their liberty easily. Then we have the enigma of different religions prominently in different states. Maryland was mostly Catholic. Pennsylvania, Quaker, Anglican in Virginia. So they had all of their perspectives and their denominational distinctives and interpretations weighing in. But they also had slaves, some of them. So they had some problems. They had whether or not to even continue the slave trade. profound questions that they had different attitudes and solutions for as they represented the states that Senate. I believe one of the greatest miracles in the history of our country was Ben Franklin's prayer. Because before that, they weren't getting anywhere. They were so frustrated, and they were saying things like, Washington didn't think, if we don't succeed now, we never will. We are striving to establish the constraints on government in a unique way, inspired by Isaiah 33:22 through the elucidation and clarification of Montesquieu. The Lord is the judge, the Lord is the lawgiver, the Lord is the king, he will save us, understanding that only God was perfect. But here came the three branches of government right out of Isaiah. Then they begin to say, well, as they begin to realize they're going to have people making laws, not angels, they were very jealous of being overrun by the maybe big populous states or the bigger states. They had interior issues, maritime issues. When this prayer happened, and John really touched on it, this magnificent prayer that God governs in the affairs of men, and about the sparrow falling and all that. And Ben Franklin even referred to the Holy Scriptures with a deference that no deist could. But then harmony was restored. Harmony that really a man, he gave us the preview from what Roger Sherman had proposed before. The brilliant Connecticut Compromise of two houses. One, where every state, no matter how big or small, South Dakota or North Dakota, could have two senators, even if they didn't have 1 million people, or at that time, 30,000 people. And then they would have a census that they were going to have shortly thereafter, and every 10 years thereafter, census to determine the other house, the People's House, the House of Representatives. A profound and brilliant compromise. Like a House of Commons and a House of Lords almost, because of the 6-year term for the senators. We'll get into the details of the first article of the Constitution tomorrow, or maybe even today. But this was an amazing accomplishment, and I believe the difference we all struggle with, anybody that's involved in government or writing legislation or contending for it, is where is a compromise fundamental to our truth and our core and our biblical beliefs or our constitutional beliefs, and when does it make good sense to be functional? And these guys found it, and I believe it was an inspired thing, not inspired to the level of holy inspiration, but God's inspired word was a big part of it. Roger Sherman actually attended Jonathan Edwards' church. This man that was the lightning rod of the Great Awakening, which we might even touch on tomorrow some. But they wanted to count the slaves from Virginia. They wanted to count the slaves as full people when it came to how many representatives they'd have in the House of Representatives. But they were going to do taxation based on per capita. So they didn't want to count them for that. They didn't want to count them at all for that. So they came up with the amazing 3/5 compromise. And this compromise, so these black people are really people. They were 3/5 of a people. Ironically, people believe, a lot of scholars believe, that there's no possible way Jefferson could have ever been president. I mean, it was deadlocked between him and Burr if it weren't for the 3/5 vote for all the slaves in Virginia. So the 3/5 compromise was both for taxes, and they dealt with that, they swallowed hard, and for the representation, and they dealt with it and came to that. And then the continuation of the slave trade was another profound compromise. It was going to end, but not for 20 years. Somehow, they figured out a timing. 3 compromises where they could get their 9 ratification states. And we could have a constitution that has now the longest lived republic in the history of mankind. An amazing thing. Well, the closing days of the convention, they had a committee on July 26th to work out the details. Then they presented the report, and the delegates refined it until after the 8th of September. The Committee on Style appointed to draft it, Gouverneur Morris, did most of the writing of the final draft. On the 12th of September, the Committee on Style presented the report. They considered it and adopted it with a few minor changes the 15th of September. And then on a great day that I think we really need to be celebrating, promoting, the signing of the Constitution. The majority from each state signed, but 3 delegates did not, and so forth. You can check out all of those details. Sitting there, and I had a friend of mine that just went to Constitution Hall, or Declaration Hall, as some people say, and referred to this remark of Ben Franklin. Because he looked at the etching, had been sitting there, kind of musing on the etching of the sun on the back of George Washington's chair, the president's chair, and he said, I have often in the course of the session and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was a rising or a setting sun. But now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. Later on they asked, what have you given us? A woman asked him, and he said, well, it's a republic if you can keep it. Well, there is all kinds of ratification debates and that sort of thing, and we're going to try to jump into the Constitution itself. But we had to go through some of these prerequisites to get a sense of where we are and the hand of God, which we're even going to talk in the first session tomorrow about God's providential hand on America. But again, I want to call John back here to talk about some of the ratification debate and get into the preamble. That's the other one in front of the first article, and see if we can't jump into the first article a little bit. And we're going to wrap up start for some questions at 4:45. So if you have any questions, we want you to be ready with them. And we're going to finish precisely right at 5 o'clock, and we'll be willing to linger and discuss things with you and sell some books if we can. Tonight we have a rally at the Dakota. Restore Our Republic. That's the name of my website, restoreourrepublic.com. A plan for 2012. My book, Threefold Plan to Save America, says find people like Patrick Henry, who said we got to have a Bill of Rights. People that stand for the next generation. Then we got to make a commitment to them of time and money every month, and then we got to fast and pray. A simple plan. So we'll be talking more about that tonight. God bless you, sir, and I've appreciated so much what we've had so far, and he'll wrap up today's session.
As we talk about the ratification, I'd like to begin with the word Federalist. Now, what does Federalist mean? That's going to be essential to understand as we get into this ratification debate. Today, we use the word federal simply meaning the folks in Washington, D.C., and their various offices that they might have locally. In Alabama, when we think about the Federals, we think about the people who are going to come up into the hills and take our stills and stop us moonshining. But the word federal originally had a very different meaning than that. The word had to do with a covenant. And the idea of federal originally was the idea of cooperative government. That we would have a form of government where some powers would be at the national level, other powers would be exercised at the state level. And between those two, that was where the covenant was all about, and so that's what the term federal originally meant. Now, up until 1787, everybody in America would call themselves a Federalist, because everybody agreed we want a government where there are some powers in the national level and some powers that are going to be exercised at the state level. They would disagree as to how much power at each level, but on that point you could say everybody would call himself a Federalist. Now when the convention ends and the ratification debates begin, one of the first things that happens, of course, is the Constitution goes to Congress. Congress approves it very quickly and then sends it to the states for ratification. But at this time, the Federalists are the ones who support ratification of the Constitution. And the anti-federalists then become those who are opposed. Now that was quite a propaganda victory for the supporters of the Constitution, because as I say, federalist is a term that everybody thought was the ideal form of government at that time. And the anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, kind of let themselves get manipulated into calling themselves the anti-federalists. Kind of like a great propaganda victory that many of us here in America had several decades ago when we started talking about being pro-family. And the other side, well, here's how us anti-family people feel about it. That put them at a disadvantage because everybody was pro-family. Well, it was the same way then. Federalist, after the Constitution is adopted, becomes a person who supports, or after the Constitution has been sent to the states, a Federalist now is somebody who supports the Constitution, and an anti-Federalist is somebody who opposes it. Now, once the Constitution is ratified, the term changes again. And this time, the Federalists afterwards are those who believe that the Constitution, especially those portions that grant power to the federal government, should be interpreted broadly. And those who think they should be interpreted more narrowly are called the Democrats or the Republicans, or the full title was the Democratic Republican. And of course the Democratic Republicans, or possibly the best term for them is the Jeffersonians, become the ancestor of the Democratic Party, which of course has changed direction 180 degrees since that time. But understand that as we leave the convention, those who support ratification call themselves the Federalist. And they have an advantage. The advantage is that they have gone through 3 months at this convention. They have been going over the Constitution syllable by syllable and parsing it and arguing about it. And so they are intimately familiar with its contents. Most of the anti-federalists haven't seen it. Remember, the proceeds at the convention were in confidence. Part of the reason for that, they didn't want to stir up all kinds of rumors of what might be going on. Part of the reason, too, was they wanted everybody at the convention to be free to say exactly what he thought, without fear as to how it might affect his chances of getting elected to some office later on. And as a result, they had an agreement that none of the notes that anybody had taken about the convention would be released until the last delegate to the convention had died. And that was James Madison. He was one of the youngest delegates, and he died in his 80s in approximately 1837. That's when we first see his notes on the convention. By that time, most of the formative constitutional decisions have already been made. But as I say, the Federalists have that advantage. They've taken the name, but also they are familiar, and so they get a head start on the anti-Federalists. But the anti-Federalists do have some good arguments to make. And one of their arguments is that this whole constitutional convention went way beyond what it was ever intended to do. And several on the floor of the convention had wondered about that. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, a general from South Carolina, stood up and said, wait a minute. Continental Congress gave us authority to revise the articles and suggest amendments thereto. They didn't give us any authority to draft a whole new constitution. Do we have a right to do this? Well, the majority of delegates, really a consensus of the delegates, concluded that yes, since anything we do has to be submitted to the Congress, we can propose whatever we wish, and if Congress doesn't like it, or if the states don't ratify it, they can send us back to the drawing board, or send somebody else back to the drawing board. But that's one of the arguments that the anti-federalists made, is this convention went way beyond what it was authorized to do, and there was some merit to that argument. Several raised objections about judicial review, and the Constitution didn't expressly say whether the courts had authority to strike acts of Congress down as unconstitutional. Some of the delegates, in the very few times they discussed it, some of them thought that the courts should have that power, several thought that they shouldn't. But that was unclear, and the Federalists were afraid of this, or the Anti-Federalists, the opponents, were afraid of this, and that's a very good argument they made. They also argued that any defects in the Articles of Confederation could be corrected by a few amendments. We don't need to have a whole new Constitution. Let's just have a few well-placed amendments to the Articles, and that'll solve whatever we need. The problem with that argument, of course, is that no amendment could ever be passed without the unanimous consent of all 13 states, and several states, particularly Rhode Island, were not likely to agree to anything. So those are some of the arguments that are raised. Patrick Henry was one of the strongest opponents. Patrick Henry argued that the problem here with this Constitution is, well, among the various things, the lack of a Bill of Rights. And when we get to the Bill of Rights, we'll see some of the reasons they chose not to put a Bill of Rights in at first. But Henry argued against the lack of a Bill of Rights, as others had. He also argued that the states themselves would lose power, especially the smaller states. If the Constitution were ratified, they'd be dominated by the larger states. But one of his arguments is that we are giving the same body, Congress, control over the purse, that is, the power to raise taxes, and control over the sword, the power to declare war. And notice the way Henry phrases his argument on his Calvinist view of the depravity of human nature. He says, "Where are your checks in this government? Your strongholds will be in the hands of your enemies. It is on a supposition that our American governors shall be honest, that all the good qualities of this government are founded, but its defective and imperfect construction puts it in their power to perpetuate the worst of mischiefs, should they be bad men. And, sir, would not all the world, from the eastern to the western hemisphere, blame our distracted folly in resting our rights upon the contingency of our rulers being good or bad? Show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men, without a consequent loss of liberty." Well, that's a pretty powerful argument. But the various states and their ratifying conventions looked at the Constitution, and it moved gradually toward ratification. Delaware is sometimes called the Constitution State because Delaware was the first state to ratify. They ratified it unanimously on the 6th of December of 1787. Pennsylvania then ratified just a week later on the 12th of December, and that was closer. It was a vote of 46 to 23. New Jersey ratified on the 18th of December, and then they decided to take a vacation and all go out to Terry Peak and ski over Christmas vacation. And so they didn't come back together until January, and Georgia ratified unanimously on the 2nd of January of '88. Connecticut, largely at the suggestion of Roger Sherman and out of respect for him, ratified next, and Connecticut ratified on the 9th of January by a vote of 128 to 40. There was some opposition among some of the Puritans up there. They were afraid of what kind of power this would place in the federal government, and there were some that were concerned that the Constitution was not explicit enough in its recognition of God or the Christian religion. And we'll get to that more in the First Amendment. But then came to Massachusetts, and Massachusetts was next to Virginia, the largest state in the Union, and so Massachusetts is very important. And the thinking was that it was probably going to lose in Massachusetts. But there were two people in particular who stood out at that convention. Both of them were in ill health. Sam Adams came to the convention in very bad health and said that, he had been, some called him the father of the American Revolution. and certainly very much one who opposed centralized government. But he said, there's a lot of things in this Constitution I don't like, but I think it's better than what we have right now. And with misgivings, I intend to vote yes. And then John Hancock was brought into the convention on a stretcher. And he too expressed some of the same concerns, but he said, I'm going to support it. And with the support of John Hancock and the support of Samuel Adams, Connecticut, or rather Massachusetts, ratified the Constitution by a vote of 187 to 168. If you're looking at the book, that's a mixed print. It should be 168, not 68. And there was about 9 votes would have made the decision, the difference there. Maryland then ratified by a vote of 63 to 11. South Carolina by a vote of 149 to 73. And at this time, all eyes now are on Virginia. Virginia is the largest state in the Union at this time, and in some ways has become the intellectual center at this time. You know, you might say in the 1600s that the intellectual center of America was up in Boston. In the first half of the 1700s, the intellectual center had moved to Philadelphia. It's moving southward. In the last half of the 1700s, the intellectual center had moved to Virginia. And of course, as you all know, since then it has moved to South Alabama. But we keep it a carefully guarded secret. Most people don't recognize that. But both sides are lined up for debate. And you have on the Federalist side, you have George Washington, although he is not actually there at the ratifying convention. You have James Madison, a brilliant man. You have John Marshall, one day to become the man that we call the greatest of all of the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court. You have George Wythe, founder of the nation's first law school. You have various others that are lined up in support of the Constitution. In opposition, you have George Mason, who we call sometimes the father of the Bill of Rights, and Patrick Henry. Now the Federalists came to that convention convinced that they had a substantial majority. Some have said they even expected a 50-vote majority there. But Patrick Henry, even though he was in bad health at this time, argued so persuasively against a convention, or against the ratification, that by the time they were getting close to a vote, the Federalists were very concerned they were going to lose. And so the night before the vote, the Federalists announced to all those who were undecided that if the Constitution was ratified, they would immediately go to work on a Bill of Rights. Now with that, they took the vote, and Virginia ratified by a vote of 87 to 79. 4 votes would have made the difference. And at that time, the Federalists went out and celebrated, convinced that now they had the 9th state, and so the Constitution had ratified. But they didn't know, because they didn't have email or fax or other such things as that. What they didn't know was that actually the Constitution was already ratified, because New Hampshire had ratified just 6 days earlier by a vote of 57 to 46. Now they still needed Virginia to be part of the Union, but the Constitution was already the law of the land when New Hampshire did its ratification. The Anti-Federalists, meantime, there was a crowd of Anti-Federalists that gathered outside the house there and were threatening violence. Patrick Henry came out and addressed them, and he said, the Constitution has been ratified. We are all Federalists now. I suggest you all go home. And they did. Well, I don't know if they went home, but anyway, they dispersed. And I don't think anybody but Patrick Henry had the kind of respect that could have persuaded them to do that. And for the rest of his life, Patrick Henry remained a strong supporter of the Constitution. Well, we do have several other states yet. New York ratified by a very close vote, 30 to 27, and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay were mainly instrumental in getting New York to ratify. The governor, DeWitt Clinton, was strongly opposed. The three delegates that they had sent were Hamilton and then Lansing and Yates. Lansing and Yates were basically tools of DeWitt Clinton, and their instructions were they were to fight every kind of change at the convention, and that's why Hamilton left in the middle of the convention. He was always being outvoted by his own delegation. His own state's vote was always being cast against him, and so he left. Then, as things progressed, Lansing and Yates became disillusioned, and they left the convention. Washington sent out a message to Hamilton saying they had left. You can come back and represent New York now, and he did. But anyway, New York ratified by a vote of 30 to 27. Then North Carolina, a year later, 21 November of 1789, by a vote of 194 to 77, and that leaves Rhode Island. Now, Rhode Island was being called Rogue Island for quite a number of reasons, and the other states were now starting to treat Rogue Island as a separate country. And finally, 3 years after the convention, on the 29th of May of 1790, Rhode Island ratified the Constitution, and they did so by a vote of 34 to 32. So there is the ratification. Well, let's move on now. Let's at least look at the preamble to the Constitution. It begins with the words, "We the people." Now, Patrick Henry argued at the Virginia Ratifying Convention, what right did they have to say, "We the people"? They were delegates of the states. They didn't have the right to speak for the people. It is each state that speaks for its people. They needed to say, "We the states," not "We the people." And it has been an argument since that time whether the Constitution was ratified by the people or whether it was ratified by the states. And there are good arguments on both sides. The delegates were selected by the states and came representing the states. Each state had one vote at the convention to be cast as a majority of the delegates present and voting chose to cast that vote. And then the states ratified as states. Each state ratified in a ratifying convention, but the delegates to that convention were selected by the people, but the people of the state. So I think you could make an argument either way as to whether the ratification is by the people or by the states. But I think the stronger argument is that the states had a very important role in the ratification process. "We the people," though, shows the covenantal nature of government power. It's the idea, as the founders understood it, and they got this partly from John Locke, who in turn takes the idea in his treatise on civil government, the idea that government is by social compact. He derives this and bases it upon the covenant that God made with Noah after the flood. And he says further, it's based upon the 10 Commandments, particularly the commandment, "Honor thy father and thy mother," which is the source, he says, not just of parental authority, but all governmental authority, because it is parents then who delegate authority to civil government. And so the idea, "we the people," shows the consensual nature of government, the compactual nature of government. And then they set forth 6 purposes for which they are establishing this government, in order to, those go on to say the 6th, first, to form a more perfect union, and I guess maybe some grammarian might say they should have said form a more nearly perfect union, but rules of grammar were different in those days, as were rules of spelling, punctuation, and capitalization and the like. And remember that we had had insufficient government under the Articles, so a more perfect union than what we had under the Articles. To establish justice, and bear in mind there was no federal judiciary system under the Articles. To ensure domestic tranquility, probably a reference to some of the disturbances like Shays' Rebellion, and one could argue whether this new form of government was needed for that. But at any rate, that is one of their purposes. To provide for the common defense, and defense is both a national matter and a state matter, as we're going to see as we get to Article 1 and some of the powers of Congress over declaring war and over the militias, but how some of those powers are reserved to the states, and to promote the general welfare. Now, I'll talk more about general welfare when you get to Article 1, Section 8. But suffice it to say with these are not grants of power. Grants of power are found as we go through the rest of the Constitution. All the preamble is doing here is setting forth the basic purposes of government. And notice the last of these purposes: to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now, the word blessing implies a gift from a superior to an inferior. And the very fact that they speak about liberty as a blessing tells us that they recognize that it comes from a higher source than man and a higher source than government. And when they say that it is for ourselves and our posterity, that shows that they did intend, as John Marshall said, a constitution for the ages, that it was supposed to stand the test of time. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And you can emphasize they're united. You can also emphasize states. Now, as I said, the preamble is short for a reason, and that's that we already really had a preamble in the Declaration, and you might say that the preamble, or rather the Declaration, sets forth the ideals upon which this nation is founded. The Constitution sets forth the practical means by which those ideals are to be realized in a society of imperfect people like you and me. There was an argument starting around 1900, launched by a man named Charles Beard, who wrote a book called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, and I'd like to think that argument has been well refuted, but Beard argued that really the Constitution was a betrayal of the ideals of the Declaration. The ideals of the Declaration were set by visionaries like Jefferson, but by 1787 the reactionaries had taken over, and the Constitution was a conservative document to preserve the interests of the wealthy classes. Well, I think that argument is easily refuted, noting that both wealthy and poorer states, larger and smaller states, commercial and agricultural states, all supported the Constitution, and there's no such divisions as we see who is supporting the Constitution here. But also the Constitution goes much further than does the Declaration in setting forth a republican form of government. There's another way you can look at it, and that's the Declaration establishes the country, the nation. The Constitution establishes the government. And the country and the government are not the same thing. I saw a bumper sticker once that said, "My country is entitled to my love and loyalty. My government must earn it." And there's some validity in that. Anyway, I think at this time we've come to the close of the preamble, and so we'll wait till tomorrow morning, and you're right, Mark, we didn't get further than this, but tomorrow morning we'll begin with Article 1. So now that we have 10 minutes to 5, let's take some time for questions, because as a law professor, I have a lot of questions that I want to ask. But that's not the way you do it here. You ask us questions. Mark, why don't you come on up with me here, and let's see if we can get some answers together. Yes, go ahead.
A distinction between a republic and a democracy. There's that continuous argument. It's common belief that we're a democracy, and yet we are a constitutional republic, but I don't understand the definition distinction between those two.
Did you want to address that?
Let me
Go
take
ahead.
a couple of whacks at it. A pure democracy would be 50% plus one of the people would decide a public policy issue. Probably one of the best ways you can tell what a republic is in the Electoral College. why they gave us checks and balances. What the whole idea of a Republican form of government is to choose a servant who will go and represent you in Washington in the federal level. And if we didn't, for example, if we didn't have the Electoral College, presidential candidates would never come to South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming. They'd have no reason to. If we were just a democracy, we just have what you call retail politics. You just have blasts of publicity and commercials on both coasts in Illinois and Texas. And we would have no input. Another thing that's really important to see how is the fact that we actually have a Senate that completely defies a democracy, because South Dakota has just as much power in the Senate as New York or California. That's even a better example of the difference, is our bicameral form of legislation. Any other comments that you'd like to make?
Yes, I just add a couple of things. First of all, when John Adams made the statement that the very definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men. The idea that even those who are in leadership in the country are subject to the law. Second thing would be that whereas democracy in the very pure sense is the people themselves meeting and deciding everything, in a republic it's more done by representatives. Now Greece, and people talk about Greece as being the fountain of democracy, which is nonsense. Most of the Greek city-states were nothing but tyrannies, and even Athens, within Athens, about 40% of the population was slave, and the only people that had any kind of rights whatsoever were free adult males. And anyway, but they would have a meeting of all free men in the towns, thousands of them, to make all of the decisions. It was unwieldy, it was unworkable, it was unstable, and it was short-lived. And several times you see Athens establishing democracy, and inevitably it collapses into tyranny once again. So the idea that you elect representatives to make decisions for you, and not just because you want that person there doing exactly what the majority in his district wants, but because you trust that person's judgment. And he's not always going to agree with you. You know, if that's all it was, that we elect somebody because he agrees with the majority of his district all the time, well, we really wouldn't need a Congress then. We could just have some very sophisticated computerized polling on every issue, and we'd decide everything that way. But obviously, one of the reasons you trust a person enough to elect that person to Congress is you believe his values are similar to yours. And if it turns out they aren't, then you vote that person out of office. But notice how we talk about a person in office, that if that person votes the way we want that person to vote, even though the majority in his district want otherwise and it's not popular to do, we say that person is a statesman, not a politician. But if we're in the majority and that congressman votes against what the majority of us want, we say, oh, he's just sold out of the special interests, he's lost touch with the people at home. Well, we can't really have it both ways, but that illustrates some of the difference between a republic and a democracy. Probably one more thing would be that in a republic, the majority generally runs things, but a minority has certain rights that even the majority cannot take away. And so putting those things together, I think, give us a good definition of a republic.
Thank you so much.
And no question, by the way, I'll just say that you read through the Federalist Papers, and most of the time in the Federalist Papers, when they use that word democracy, they use it in an unfavorable sense as mob rule and that which is eventually going to lead to a demagogue and dictatorship. Occasionally they will use the word democracy in the very generic sense of representative government as a whole. And I would just suggest this to you, that when you hear politicians that talk about our country being a democracy, if an opportunity arises, you might want to explain the difference, but I wouldn't get too hot about it right away, because many people will talk about America being a democracy using that very generic sense of representative government. So be careful how much you read into that.
Yeah, and we're about done.
There's a question over here.
He's gonna, what?
I wonder if I could add that quote from John Adams again.
Yes, the very definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men. Good example of a republic was Persia in the days of King Cyrus the Great. Remember Darius, who was the Persian governor over Babylonia, the Babylonian their province, and they bring him this decree to sign, and once he signs it, they're repeatedly saying, the laws of the Medes and the Persians that changeth not. That was the origin of Persian law, that once the king had signed a decree, he was bound by that decree for its entire duration. A Babylonian king could have just ripped it up and said, that law is hereby repealed. A Persian could not do that. Now later, as we move on in Persian history, they become more like an Oriental despotism, but originally, that's the seed of a concept of a republic right there.
All right, we agreed to stop exactly at 5. I'd sure like to encourage you to come out to the Dakota tonight and come tomorrow, and we're going to have a tea party. But you would be so blessed with any of that stuff that John has written. It's magnificent stuff. The Bulletproof George Washington New England Primer. All of these things are great gifts. This is a wonderful way that people can perpetuate these truths that are so beautiful and powerful. We'll be happy to just hang around and answer questions as long as you want to do that, except that I got to go pick up my extension on my taxes and have a little bite to eat before I go to the Dakota. But I hope to see some of you again, and I can't thank you enough. And I personally want to thank Dale for his great Family Heritage Alliance and how quickly this has become a real leadership voice in this state. And now it's branching out into other states. Dale's work on his web and his communication skills are just amazing for a guy over 50. I think he's 51. And my fledgling websites are kind of pitiful and primal, let's just say that.
Young whippersnapper.
Yeah, but I do want you all to stand and give a round of applause for John Eisel, because this is very, very special. This man is absolutely full of knowledge and wisdom and tempered with a true theology based on the inerrant, inspired Word of God. And thanks again, sir, so much for a good day.